The metal chair felt cold against Thexvar's scaled back. His forearms rested uneasily on the table as he stared at the recording device between them. The debriefing room smelled of disinfectant and fear. 3 months had passed since the retreat from Earth, but the nightmares still came every sleep cycle. Officer Colthera sat across from him, her green eyes studying his face. She had not been to Earth. She did not understand what they had faced there. Her uniform was clean and pressed. Her scales shone with health. Thexvar's own scales were dull and cracked from stress. "Begin your report, Commander," Colthara said. Her voice was calm and professional. Thexvar's mandibles clicked nervously. He had given this report 12 times already. Each time his superiors looked at him like he was broken, like he was making up stories to cover his failure. But the scars on his body were real. The missing troops were real. The terror that still gripped him was very real. "They are not like us," he began, his voice rough. "The humans. We studied them for cycles before the invasion. We thought we understood them. We were wrong." Colthara made notes on her tablet. "Please be specific. What made them different from our projections?" Thexvar laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everything. We expected them to surrender when faced with superior force. We expected them to break when their cities burned. We expected them to beg for mercy when their armies fell." He paused, remembering. They did none of these things. The first encounter played in his mind like a recording he could not stop. His unit had landed outside a human settlement called Buchan. Intelligence said it was defended by 50 human soldiers. Easy prey for his battalion of 800 Vorthak warriors. "Tell me about your first contact," Colthera prompted. "Sergeant Deho." Thexvar whispered the name like a prayer. "That was his name. I learned it later after we captured their communications. He was their squad leader. 20 humans against my entire forward unit." The memory was sharp and painful. Thexvar's troops had advanced through the forest, confident in their superior numbers and weapons. The humans had let them come close, before opening fire. But it was not the ambush that haunted him. It was what came after. "The sergeant took a plasma bolt to his left arm," Thexvar continued. "It should have killed him. At minimum, it should have stopped him fighting. Instead, he tore off his ruined arm and used the blood to blind 3 of my soldiers before killing them with his sidearm." Colthara stopped writing. "You mean he continued fighting while severely wounded?" "Not just fighting. Winning." Thexvar's voice grew distant. He moved like death itself. When his weapon ran out of ammunition, he picked up rocks. When he ran out of rocks, he used his bare hands. My soldiers were trained killers, but they ran from him. They ran from a one-armed human covered in his own blood. The silence stretched between them. Colthara had fought in 3 wars before Earth. She had seen brave enemies before. But the look in Thexvar's eyes told her this was something different. "How many humans were in that first engagement?" she asked. 20. Thexvar repeated. "We lost 67 soldiers before we retreated. Not withdrew tactically. Retreated, running through the forest while humans hunted us like animals." He remembered the sounds most of all. Human voices calling to each other in their strange language. They did not sound afraid or desperate. They sounded excited, like predators who had found fresh prey. "The sergeant died that day," Thexvar said, "but he took 15 of my soldiers with him, and the way he died." He shuddered. Even with 3 plasma bolts in his chest, he kept moving. He kept fighting. He died standing up, still trying to reach us with his one good arm. Kolthara had been taking notes, but now she just listened. She had read the casualty reports from Earth. Millions of Vorthak dead, entire fleets destroyed. But hearing it from someone who was there made it real in a way that numbers could not. They do not fight like other species, Thexvar explained. Most beings fight to live. Humans fight to win. They will sacrifice anything to achieve victory. Their own lives, their cities, their entire world if necessary. The interrogation sessions came back to him. The few human prisoners they had taken early in the war. Before they learned to kill themselves rather than be captured, the humans had been polite, even friendly. They answered questions readily, shared information about their families and homes. But they never broke, never gave up military secrets, never stopped planning escape attempts. We captured a human pilot named Jun Ho in the 2nd week, Thexvar said. He had been flying for 36 straight hours when we shot him down. He should have been exhausted, broken. Instead, he spent 2 days in our prison learning our guard rotations. Then he killed 6 guards with a makeshift weapon and nearly escaped. Nearly? We stopped him at the perimeter fence. He was climbing over when we found him. He could have surrendered then. Instead, he threw himself on the electrified wire rather than be recaptured. Thexvar's voice grew quiet. He was smiling when he died. Kolthara put down her tablet. You speak of them like they were not rational beings. That is what made them so dangerous, Thexvar replied. They were completely rational. Everything they did made perfect sense from their perspective. They simply operated from different principles than us. He thought of the human children they had encountered. Younglings who should have been protected, hidden away from war. Instead, human parents had taught them to fight, had given them weapons and training, had turned them into tiny soldiers who fought with the same terrifying intensity as the adults. They call it love, Thexvar said suddenly. This emotion that drives them to impossible acts. We have similar feelings for our offspring, our mates, but human love is different. It extends to strangers, to abstract concepts, to their entire species. Explain. A human mother will die for her children. This we understand. But humans will also die for other humans' children, for people they have never met, for ideas they believe in. He paused. This makes them unpredictable in ways our strategists never accounted for. The recording device hummed between them, capturing words that would be studied and analyzed by intelligence experts across the Vorthak Empire. But Thexvar knew they would not understand. They had not seen what he had seen. How? Many engagements did you participate in? Kolthara asked. 43 battles over 8 months, Thexvar replied. We never won a single one. Not really. Even when we took ground, even when we achieved our objectives, the humans made us pay such a price that victory felt like defeat. He remembered the faces of his soldiers as the war dragged on. The growing fear in their eyes, the way they flinched at shadows, the requests for transfer away from Earth that began flooding in after the first month. They broke us, Thexvar admitted, not through superior technology or numbers. They broke us by refusing to be broken themselves, by fighting with such ferocity that death became preferable to facing them again. Kolthara leaned forward. You are saying that humans defeated the Vorthak Empire through willpower alone. I am saying that humans are apex predators that learn to smile, Thexvar replied, and we were foolish enough to invade their hunting ground. The debriefing was far from over. There were 7 more sessions scheduled, each focusing on different aspects of the human war machine. But Thexvar already knew that no amount of analysis would prepare them for another encounter with humanity. Some species were meant to be left alone. Colthera returned the next day with fresh recording equipment and a thicker file of reports. Thexvar looked worse than before. His sleep had been filled with the sounds of human voices echoing through tunnels. "Tell me about New Soul," she said without preamble. Thexvar's claws scraped against the metal table. 30 days, he whispered. 30 days in hell. The siege had been meant to showcase Vorthak military might. New Sol was a major human city with over 10 million inhabitants. Command had assigned 50,000 troops to take it in 3 days. They brought siege engines, orbital bombardment support, and enough firepower to level mountains. How many? Human defenders? Colthera asked. 200, Thexvar replied. 200 humans held off 50,000 of our best soldiers for a full month. The human commander had been Captain Hyun-woo, a thin man with gray hair and calm eyes. Thexvar had seen his photograph in captured intelligence files. He looked like a teacher or clerk, not a military genius who would turn an entire city into a death trap. The surface battle lasted 6 hours, Thexvar explained. We pushed them back easily. Too easily, we realized later. Captain Hyun-woo was not trying to hold the surface. He was drawing us down. The humans had retreated into the subway system beneath New Sol. Miles of tunnels, maintenance shafts, and underground chambers that they knew like their own homes. What should have been a refuge became something far more dangerous. They had been preparing for months, Thexvar continued. Every tunnel had been rigged with explosives. Every intersection had firing positions. Every maintenance shaft had become a sniper's nest. The first squad sent down had simply vanished. No radio contact, no sounds of battle. Just silence. Then the bodies started appearing. Vorthak soldiers hung from tunnel ceilings, their throats cut. Others were found days later, apparently killed by traps so sophisticated that engineers still could not figure out how they worked. We sent in a full battalion, Thexvar said. 800 soldiers with heavy weapons and sensors. Only 12 came back out. He remembered their faces when they emerged. Good soldiers reduced to shaking wrecks who flinched at every shadow. They spoke of voices in the darkness, of humans who appeared and disappeared like ghosts, of the constant feeling, of being watched by unseen eyes. What did the survivors report? Colthera asked. Nightmares, Thexvar replied simply. They reported nightmares. The humans had turned the tunnels into a maze of death. They moved through maintenance shafts too small for Vorthak bodies. They struck from hidden positions and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. They used the city's own infrastructure as a weapon. There was a medic, Thexvar said suddenly. Sora was her name. We captured communications mentioning her. She performed surgery in the tunnels while under fire. The medical teams fascinated and horrified the Vorthak forces. Most species had non-combatant medical personnel protected by law and custom. Human medics carried weapons and fought like soldiers while still treating the wounded. Sora operated on wounded humans with one hand while shooting at my soldiers with the other, Thexvar explained. She saved 17 human lives during a 6-hour firefight. Then she picked up a rifle and led a counterattack that drove us back 3 tunnel sections. The Vorthak had adapted quickly to most human tactics, but the medics broke their understanding of warfare. How could healers also be killers? How could someone dedicate their life to saving others while being so effective at ending lives? The engineer was worse, Thexvar continued. Tai-Jin. He built weapons from garbage. Tai-Jin had been a maintenance worker before the invasion. He knew every pipe, every electrical system, every structural weakness in the underground complex. Under siege conditions, he had become a master of improvised destruction. He rigged explosive devices from kitchen appliances, Thexvar said, his voice filled with unwilling admiration. He turned the water pressure system into a weapon that crushed 3 of our soldiers. He electrified sections of tunnel using nothing but spare wire and old batteries. The Vorthak had brought sensors designed to detect conventional explosives and weapons. They were useless against Tai-Jin's creations. His traps were made from materials so common they barely registered on military scanners. How did he learn to make such weapons? Kolthera asked. He did not learn, Thexvar replied. He invented them. Every day brought new horrors from his workshop. Gas grenades made from cleaning supplies. Acid bombs constructed from car batteries. Pressure mines built into floor tiles. After 2 weeks of losses, Command had ordered the use of poison gas. The tunnels should have been perfect for chemical weapons. Enclosed spaces with limited ventilation would concentrate the toxins and force the humans to surrender or die. The gas attack failed, Thexvar said quietly. How could it fail? Gas is highly effective in confined spaces. The humans had prepared for chemical warfare too, Thexvar explained. But not in any way we expected. They did not just have gas masks and filters, they had turned the ventilation system into a weapon. Tai-Jin had rigged the air circulation to redirect the poison gas back at the attackers. Vorthak soldiers who had entered the tunnels wearing protective gear found themselves trapped in clouds of their own chemical weapons. Worse than that, Thexvar continued, they somehow mixed the gas with other compounds. The poison became more concentrated, more deadly. Our own weapon killed more of our soldiers than theirs. The psychological impact had been devastating. Soldiers began refusing orders to enter the tunnels. Officers reported increasing cases of combat stress and breakdown. The humans were not just winning through superior tactics, they were destroying the will to fight. Captain Hyunwoo sent us a message on day 23, Thexvar said. He spoke our language perfectly. He offered to discuss surrender terms. Kolthara looked up sharply. The humans offered to surrender? No, Thexvar corrected. He offered to discuss our surrender. He wanted to give us the chance to withdraw with dignity before he was forced to kill more of our soldiers. The audacity had stunned the Vorthak command. 200 humans, surrounded by 50,000 enemy troops, and they were offering terms to their besiegers. It should have been insane. Instead, after 3 weeks of devastating losses, it almost sounded reasonable. What was the response? Command. Ordered a final assault, Thexvar replied. Every available soldier was committed to taking the tunnels. We would accept no more humiliation from these creatures. The final battle had lasted 18 hours. The Vorthak threw everything they had into the underground maze. Heavy weapons, combat engineers, elite assault troops. They accepted massive casualties in exchange for forward progress. We reached their command center on the morning of day 30, Thexvar said. We thought we had won. The command center had been empty except for Captain Hyunwoo and 12 of his soldiers. They were out of ammunition and low on supplies. By any reasonable measure, they should have surrendered. Instead, they had rigged the entire section with explosives. Hyunwoo was sitting at his desk when we found him, Thexvar recalled. He was writing in a journal. He looked up when we entered, smiled, and said something in his language. Then he pressed a button. The explosion had collapsed 3 levels of tunnels. Captain Hyun-woo and his soldiers died instantly. So did over 200 Vorthak troops who had finally reached their objective. But the siege was over, Kolthara pointed out. Was it? Thexvar asked. The surviving humans had scattered into maintenance tunnels we never found. They kept fighting for another week, small groups appearing to attack our supply lines, then vanishing again. The Vorthak had officially declared victory after capturing the command center, but they had lost over 8,000 soldiers taking a city defended by 200 humans. The survivors needed 3 months of medical treatment before they were fit for duty again. Command called it a successful operation, Thexvar said bitterly. A textbook siege that achieved all objectives with acceptable losses. But you disagree? I disagree with calling 8,000 dead soldiers an acceptable loss for a city we could not hold, Thexvar replied. Within a week of our victory, human resistance cells had retaken most of the tunnels. We abandoned New Seoul after 10 days because the cost of holding it was too high. Kolthara made notes in her file. What do you think made the difference? Why were so few humans able to inflict such losses? Thexvar considered the question. They fought smart. They used every advantage the terrain gave them. But most importantly, they never stopped believing they could win. Even when surrounded and outnumbered 250 to 1, especially then, Thexvar replied. Humans become more dangerous when cornered, not less. Fear makes most species surrender. Fear makes humans fight harder. The recording device continued humming between them, capturing testimony that would be filed away and forgotten. Because the truth was too uncomfortable for Vorthak Command to accept. They had not lost to superior technology or numbers. They had lost to creatures who simply refused to give up. The third session began differently. Thexvar entered the room carrying a small container of what looked like white powder. Kolthara noticed his movements were more careful, more deliberate than before. "What is that?" she asked. "Snow," Thexvar replied, setting the container on the table. "From Earth. From the place where I learned that humans are not the apex predators on their world. They are something worse." He stared at the white crystals as they slowly melted. "They are apex predators that the other apex predators follow, willingly." The Arctic incident, as it became known in Vorthak military records, had started as a routine mop-up operation. Intelligence reported a human squad trapped behind enemy lines in the northern regions of the continent called Canada. 12 soldiers cut off from their main forces with no supplies and no hope of rescue. "How many troops did you assign to eliminate them?" Kolthara asked. 3 battalions, Thexvar replied. 7,000 soldiers. We expected to finish them in a few days and move south to join the main offensive. Instead, they had spent 90 days in a frozen wasteland, hunting ghosts that killed in the darkness and vanished with the dawn. Lieutenant Jae-sung had been their leader. Intelligence. Files described him as a maintenance officer with no combat experience. The kind of soldier who repaired vehicles and filed supply reports. Not someone who should have been able to evade an army. The first week was normal, Thexvar explained. We tracked them through the snow, found their abandoned campsites, followed their trail north into the wilderness. They were running as expected, but the trail had led them deeper into terrain that seemed designed to kill everything that entered it. Temperatures that dropped far below what Vorthak bodies could tolerate. Winds that cut through armor like blades, snowstorms that reduced visibility to 0 and lasted for days. Jae-sung was not running from us, Thexvar realized aloud. He was leading us into a place where humans had the advantage. The first deaths had seemed like accidents. Soldiers who wandered away from camp and were found frozen solid the next morning. Equipment failures that left entire squads without heat or communication. Avalanches that buried patrols in tons of snow and ice. Then we started finding the bodies, Thexvar continued. The corpses were arranged in patterns that made no sense. Vorthak soldiers positioned around campfires that had burned down to ash. Their weapons were missing, but there were no signs of struggle. They looked peaceful, as if they had simply sat down and decided to die. How many soldiers did you lose? To these accidents? Kolthera asked. 47 in the first 2 weeks, Thexvar replied. But we knew they were not accidents. We knew the humans were hunting us. The sniper had been the first proof. Yunji was her name, learned later from intercepted communications. She had been a competition shooter before the war, specializing in extreme long-range accuracy. In the Arctic wasteland, she had become something like a natural disaster. She could hit targets from distances that should have been impossible, Thexvar explained. 2 kilometers away in blizzard conditions, shooting through gaps in the storm that lasted only seconds. Officers began dying first, clean shots through the head or heart that came from nowhere and everywhere. The surviving soldiers would search for hours, but never found a trace of the shooter. No footprints, no shell casings, no heat signatures. On thermal sensors. She was not using standard human weapons, Thexvar said. The ballistics were wrong, too accurate for the conditions, too powerful for the range. Later analysis suggested that Yunji had somehow modified captured Vorthak sniper rifles to work in Arctic conditions, but the modifications were so extensive that the weapons should not have functioned at all. How did she acquire Vorthak weapons? Kolthera asked. She took them from the soldiers she killed, Thexvar replied simply. Every death made her more dangerous. Squad leader Boram had been even more disturbing. Intelligence described her as an animal trainer who worked at a zoo before the war. In the Arctic, she had become something that defied understanding. The wildlife began attacking us, Thexvar said. Bears, wolves, creatures we had no names for. They hunted in coordinated packs like trained soldiers. Arctic predators that should have avoided large groups of armed soldiers instead began stalking Vorthak patrols. They moved with purpose and intelligence that seemed impossible. They set ambushes, used terrain advantages, and coordinated attacks across multiple groups. You are saying that a human trained wild animals to fight as soldiers? Kolthara's voice was skeptical. I am saying that wild animals chose to fight alongside humans, Thexvar corrected. Boram did not train them. She communicated with them somehow, made them understand that we were enemies of their territory. The attacks escalated over the following weeks. Polar bears that should have been hibernating instead tracked Vorthak forces across hundreds of kilometers. Wolf packs that ignored their natural prey to focus on soldiers. Even smaller creatures like foxes and birds seemed to be providing intelligence to the human squad. We found one of our camps destroyed by what appeared to be a coordinated assault, Thexvar continued. 17 soldiers dead. The attack pattern suggested professional military tactics, but the wounds were from claws and teeth. Security footage from the few working cameras showed something that Vorthak analysts still refuse to believe. Animals moving in formation, using suppression tactics, even appearing to follow hand signals from a human figure barely visible in the storm. Boram was directing them, Thexvar said with certainty. She had turned the entire ecosystem into her army. After 6 weeks, Command had reinforced the operation with another 2 battalions. Fresh troops with better cold weather gear and explicit orders to end the human resistance by any means necessary. The reinforcements lasted 3 days, Thexvar reported. The new units had been led into a valley where the temperatures dropped even lower than usual. Their equipment failed simultaneously across all squads. Weapons jammed, communications died, heating systems stopped working. Then the sound started. Sounds, Colthera prompted. Human voices, Thexvar explained. Singing, calling to each other across the mountains. But the acoustics were wrong. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once. The psychological effect had been immediate and devastating. Soldiers began reporting hallucinations. Some claimed to see human figures in the snow that vanished when approached. Others insisted they could hear their names being called by voices that sounded like family members. Lieutenant J. Sung was using the environment as a weapon, Thexvar realized. The cold, the isolation, the constant threat of death, he turned our own minds against us. By the 8th week, Vorthak soldiers were refusing orders to leave their camps. Officers reported complete breakdown of unit cohesion and discipline. Soldiers who had fought in multiple campaigns were reduced to shaking wrecks who jumped at shadows. We found Sergeant Malthus on day 56, Thexvar said quietly. He was sitting in the snow without his armor, completely naked, frozen solid. But his eyes were still moving. The medical team had confirmed that Malthus was technically alive, but unresponsive to any stimulus. His body temperature was far below what should have been survivable, but his vital signs continued for another 12 hours before finally stopping. What had happened to him? Colthara asked. Fear, Thexvar replied. He had been scared to death, literally. His nervous system had shut down from terror, but his body forgot to die immediately. Similar cases began appearing throughout the remaining forces. Soldiers found in impossible states of preservation, alive but catatonic, their minds apparently broken by encounters they could not or would not describe. The final attack came on day 87, Thexvar continued. Not against our soldiers, against our equipment. Every piece of technology in the Vorthak camps had failed simultaneously. Weapons, communications, transportation, heating systems, even simple tools. The failure was so complete and coordinated that it could not have been natural. How is such sabotage possible? Your equipment has multiple redundancies and security systems. Jae Sung was a maintenance officer, Thexvar reminded her. He understood how our equipment worked better than most of our own engineers. 90 days of scavenging parts from dead soldiers had given him everything he needed. The remaining Vorthak forces had been left stranded in the Arctic with no technology, no communication, and no way to call for extraction. They were facing the same conditions that the human squad had survived for months, but without the knowledge or preparation. We surrendered on day 90, Thexvar admitted, formally requested extraction and withdrawal from the operational area. The evacuation had taken 6 more days. During that time, the human voices continued to echo across the mountains, not threatening or taunting, but singing. Songs that sounded almost like lullabies, carried on the wind from somewhere in the vast white wilderness. When the extraction ships arrived, they detected 4 human life signs, Thexvar said. Only 4. Out of the original 12-person squad. What happened to the others? They died, Thexvar replied. Probably in the first few weeks. Jae Sung, Yoonji, Bo-Ram, and one other had survived for 3 months in conditions that killed hundreds of our soldiers. Colthara noticed that Thexvar brought something different to each session. Today it was a small piece of twisted metal, no longer than his claw. He set it on the table with the reverence others might show to religious artifacts. Debris from the human destroyer Incheon, he explained. The ship that refused to die. The space engagement had been routine at first. Human naval forces were retreating after losing 3 major battles in the outer system. The destroyer Incheon was one of 12 ships providing rear-guard action for the evacuation. Intelligence rated it as a minor threat with limited combat capability. How many ships did you assign to engage this destroyer? Kolthara asked. The entire 4th Fleet, Thexvar replied. 67 warships including the flagship Dominion of Worlds. Command wanted to make an example of human naval forces. The Incheon had been commanded by Sun Ho, a career naval officer, with 20 years of experience. His ship was 40 years old, barely half the size of a Vorthak cruiser, and armed with weapons that were obsolete by galactic standards. The engagement should have lasted minutes, Thexvar continued. Instead, it took 6 hours and cost us 8 ships. The battle had started normally. The Vorthak fleet opened fire at maximum range, expecting to destroy the human ship quickly and move on to more important targets. But Sun Ho had other plans. He did not try to escape, Thexvar explained. He flew directly at our formation. 1 ship against 67, charging into our guns like he thought he could win. The Incheon's weapons were indeed obsolete, but Sun Ho used them with precision that amazed even Vorthak tactical analysts. He targeted specific systems on enemy ships rather than trying to achieve kills. Shield generators, weapon mounts, sensor arrays. Each shot was calculated to cause maximum disruption. Pilot Yejin was flying that day, Thexvar said. We learned her name from intercepted communications. She made that old ship dance like a fighter craft. Yejin had been a civilian cargo pilot before the war. She knew every quirk and limitation of older ship designs because she had spent years flying vessels that should have been scrapped decades earlier. In combat, this experience became a deadly advantage. She flew through our formation like we were standing still, Thexvar continued. Using our own ships as cover, exploiting blind spots in our firing arcs, making attack runs that should have been impossible. The Incheon took massive damage in the first exchange. Hull breaches, engine, damage, weapon systems destroyed. Any rational commander would have surrendered or attempted to escape. Sun Ho ordered his ship to ram the Vorthak flagship. He succeeded, Thexvar said quietly. The collision had been devastating for both vessels. The Incheon's forward section was completely destroyed, but the impact crippled the Dominion of Worlds' main drive systems. Both ships were left drifting, barely holding together. That should have ended the engagement, Kolthara observed. For any other species, yes, Thexvar agreed. But humans do not understand the concept of defeat. With their ship dying around, the human crew had begun launching escape pods. But these were not ordinary evacuation procedures. Communications officer Kiwoo had rigged the pods with improvised weapons and guidance systems. They turned their escape pods into missiles, Thexvar explained. Piloted missiles with human crews who had volunteered for suicide missions. Yejin had taken manual control of the lead pod, somehow coaxing more speed and maneuverability from the simple craft than its designers had thought possible. She led a formation of 12 pods in coordinated attacks against Vorthak engine clusters. The pods were too small for our point defense systems, Thexvar continued, and the humans were flying them like they had nothing to lose. Because they did have nothing to lose. Their ship was destroyed, their fleet was retreating, and their home system was under siege. The logical response would have been to surrender and hope for merciful treatment. Instead, They chose to cause as much damage as possible before dying. Kaiwu was broadcasting during the attack, Thexvar said. Human war songs on all frequencies. The translations made no sense to us, but the effect on our crews was immediate. Human music, it turned out, had properties that Vorthak neural systems could not process correctly. The rhythms and harmonies created feedback loops in alien brain, chemistry, inducing disorientation and panic responses. Our crews began experiencing symptoms similar to combat stress, Thexvar explained. Difficulty concentrating, impaired decision-making, some even collapsed at their stations. The war songs were not random selections. Kiwu had somehow identified frequencies that would be most disruptive to Vorthak physiology. Songs about death and sacrifice that became weapons more effective than plasma cannons. While we were dealing with the psychological attack, Yejin led her pods into our formation, Thexvar continued. She targeted the engine intakes on our heavy cruisers. The escape pod attacks had been precisely coordinated. Each pod struck at the exact moment when target vessels were most vulnerable. Engine systems that were designed to withstand weapons, fire could not survive kinetic impacts from desperate humans willing to die for a few seconds of damage. How many ships did you lose to these attacks? Kolthera asked. 3 cruisers destroyed, 2 more crippled, Thexvar replied. 5,000 Vorthak lives lost to 12 human escape pods. But the horror was not over. The Incheon's artificial intelligence system had been damaged in the ramming attack, its processors corrupted and dying. Instead of shutting down gracefully, it had begun broadcasting on every available channel. The AI was playing human lullabies, Thexvar said, his voice barely above a whisper. The songs were simple melodies that human parents sang to their children. Gentle, soothing sounds that should have been harmless. But heard through alien communication, systems filtered through damaged processors, they became something else entirely. Our crews began hallucinating, Thexvar continued. They reported seeing human children on their ships, dead children, singing the same songs the AI was broadcasting. The psychological impact spread through the fleet like a plague. Soldiers, who had fought in dozens of campaigns, were reduced to weeping, terrified beings who could not function. Officers reported mass breakdowns in discipline and morale. The medical teams had no explanation, Thexvar said. There was nothing physically wrong with the affected crew members, but they could not stop seeing the children. Some Vorthak soldiers had become catatonic, staring at empty spaces where they insisted human children were standing. Others became violent, attacking their own crew members because they believed them to be enemy infiltrators. Ship after ship reported the same symptoms. How long did this continue? Kolthera asked. 4 days, Thexvar replied. The AI kept broadcasting until its power finally failed completely. By then, the damage was done. The Fourth Fleet had been reduced to 39 functional ships, with crews so traumatized that many required months of medical treatment before returning to duty. The human destroyer was nothing but debris and radiation, but it had achieved something no military strategist thought possible. Sunho sent a final message before his ship's power failed, Thexvar said. A text transmission to our flagship. What did it say? Thank you for the honor of fighting such worthy opponents, Thexvar recited from memory. We hope our families can be friends when this war is over. The message had been signed by every surviving crew member of the Incheon. Humans who were about to die in the vacuum of space, taking time to express hope for future peace between their species. Even while killing thousands of our soldiers, they maintained respect for us as fellow beings, Thexvar continued. They fought with absolute determination while hoping for eventual reconciliation. The contradiction had puzzled Vorthak analysts for months. How could the same species be both utterly ruthless in combat and genuinely compassionate toward their enemies? It seemed to violate everything they understood about warfare and psychology. The final horror came 3 days after the battle, Thexvar said. Rescue teams found survivors in the wreckage of the Incheon. Survivors? After 4 days. In hard vacuum? 7 crew members, Thexvar confirmed. They had sealed themselves into a damaged section that still had minimal atmosphere. No heat, no power, no supplies. They should have died within hours. Instead, the humans had survived by sharing body heat, rationing the last drops of water from emergency supplies and somehow maintaining hope despite being surrounded by the corpses of their friends. They were rescued by our ships, Thexvar continued, treated in our medical facilities, and every one of them asked about the condition of Vorthak wounded from the battle. Even as prisoners of war, the human survivors had shown more concern for their enemies' welfare than for their own. They offered to help treat injured Vorthak crew members, shared information about human medical techniques, and maintained polite cooperation despite their circumstances. One of them was Engineer Dong Min, Thexvar said. He spent 2 weeks in our medical bay helping our doctors understand human physiology so they could better treat future human prisoners. The irony was devastating. Humans who had just destroyed 8 Vorthak warships were now volunteering to help their captors improve prisoner treatment protocols. They killed with ruthless efficiency and healed with equal dedication. Thexvar arrived late for the 5th session. Kolthara noticed he was wearing a medical face mask, something that had never been necessary in Vorthak society before the Earth campaign. When he sat down, he placed a small vial of clear liquid on the table. Antidote, he explained, for the plague we unleashed on ourselves. The biological warfare operation had been command's answer to mounting casualties from conventional combat. Human resistance was proving far more costly than projected, so the decision was made to deploy biological agents that would force a quick surrender. The pathogen was specifically designed to target human physiology. Thexvar began. Respiratory. Infection with a 96% mortality rate. It should have ended the war in weeks. Instead, it had become the moment when Thexvar first truly understood what they were fighting. Not just soldiers or pilots or engineers, but something fundamentally different from every other species in the galaxy. Where was the biological weapon? Deployed? Kolthara asked. Geneva Medical Complex, Thexvar replied. A hospital station in orbit around Earth. We chose it because doctors would understand the futility of resistance once they saw the plague's effects. The complex housed over 50,000 humans, mostly medical personnel and their families. It should have been an easy target with minimal military value. The plan was to demonstrate the weapon's effectiveness and then offer the antidote in exchange for Earth's surrender. How quickly did the pathogen spread? Kolthara continued. Within 6 hours, 90% of the population was infected, Thexvar said. The symptoms appeared exactly as predicted. Respiratory distress, fever, organ failure. The humans should have surrendered immediately. Instead, something impossible had happened. Dr. Sang-wook, the complex's chief medical officer, had begun working on countermeasures before he even knew what pathogen he was dealing with. Sang-wook was infected in the first hour, Thexvar explained. He should have been dead within 12 hours. Instead, he worked for 72 hours straight developing treatments. The doctor had somehow maintained consciousness and cognitive function while his body was literally dying from the engineered plague. He performed medical procedures with hands that shook from fever, analyzed samples with eyes that could barely focus, and coordinated treatment protocols while coughing up blood. "How is such dedication possible?" Kolthera asked. "That is what we could never understand," Thexvar replied. "Any rational being would have focused on their own survival. Sang-Wook ignored his own condition completely and worked to save others. The complex's head nurse, Hye-Wan, had been even more disturbing to witness. She had continued treating patients even after the plague had reached its final stages in her own body. Medical sensors showed organ failure, neurological damage, and systemic collapse. Yet she kept working. Hye-Wan performed surgery on patients while her own organs were shutting down, Thexvar said. She saved 17 lives during the 12 hours before her own death. The footage from medical bay security cameras showed something that Vorthak doctors still refused to believe. A human who was medically dead according to all instruments, but whose body continued functioning long enough to complete one final operation. She died standing up, Thexvar continued, hands still holding surgical instruments, having just finished closing an incision on a patient who would survive because of her work. But the true horror was yet to come. The humans had not just tried to treat the symptoms of the engineered plague. They had somehow begun developing immunity to it. "Impossible," Kolthara stated. "The pathogen was designed to prevent immune system adaptation." "We thought so too," Thexvar agreed. "But human biology does not follow the same rules as other species. Their immune systems adapted in ways our designers never anticipated. The adaptation had not been natural evolution. It was too fast, too coordinated. Instead, the human medical teams had somehow shared information between dying patients, creating a collective understanding of the pathogen that exceeded what any individual could achieve." Quarantine Chief Insu turned the infected wards into research laboratories, Thexvar explained. Dying patients volunteered to participate in experimental treatments that would kill them even faster if they failed. Insu had been a logistics coordinator before the plague outbreak. He had no medical training beyond basic first aid, but when the crisis began, he had organized the infected population into the most efficient research operation Thexvar had ever witnessed. Patients tested treatments on themselves and shared the results with other victims before they died, Thexvar continued. Each death provided data that helped the next group of volunteers. The process had been methodical and horrifying. Humans who knew they were going to die used their remaining time to help others survive. They endured experimental procedures without anesthesia, documented their symptoms until their last breath, and passed on knowledge that gradually built toward a cure. "How many humans participated in these experiments?" Kolthara asked. "All of them," Thexvar replied. "Every infected person on the station became a test subject, even the children." The involvement of human children had been the most disturbing aspect of the entire operation. Most species protected their young above all else, keeping them safe, while adults faced danger. Human children had instead volunteered to help find a cure. They understood they were going to die, Thexvar explained. But they also understood that their deaths could help save others. So they chose to make their deaths meaningful. 8-year-old patients had allowed doctors to try experimental treatments that caused additional pain and suffering. Teenagers had insisted on participating in procedures that were almost certainly fatal. They did this not because they were forced, but because they wanted to help. The breakthrough came on day 4, Thexvar continued. A combination therapy that Sang-Wook Developed using data from over 3,000 volunteer test subjects, the treatment had not been elegant or sophisticated. It was a brutal combination of drugs, immune stimulants, and surgical procedures that would kill most species even without the plague. But it worked for humans. The mortality rate dropped from 96% to 12% within 6 hours, Thexvar said. By day 7, they had developed a cure that was 98% effective. But the humans had not stopped there. They had somehow modified the pathogen itself, turning it into a weapon against the Vorthak forces who had deployed it. How is that possible? Biological weapons cannot be reversed by the target species. They did not reverse it, Thexvar corrected. They improved it, made it more infectious, more virulent. Then they released it on our ships. The modified plague had been specifically tailored to Vorthak physiology. Humans who had been dying from the original pathogen had somehow weaponized their own infections to create something that would kill their enemies. The plague ship that delivered the biological weapon became infected within hours of the human counterstrike, Thexvar continued. 3,000 Vorthak crew members dead in less than 2 days. The speed of the reversal had shocked military command. A weapon that had taken years to develop and test had been countered, improved, and turned against them in less than a week. By humans who were simultaneously dying from the original pathogen. Dr. Sangwook sent us the cure, Thexvar said quietly. Kolthara looked up sharply. What? After developing a treatment that saved his own people, after turning our own weapon against us, he transmitted the antidote to our infected ships, Thexvar explained. No conditions, no demands for surrender. He just saved our lives. The message had been simple and direct. Complete medical files for treating the modified plague, along with detailed instructions for mass production of the antidote. It had been signed by Sang-wook and every surviving member of his medical team. Why would they save enemy lives after suffering such losses? Kolthara asked. Because they are doctors, Thexvar replied. Their oath to preserve life takes precedence over military objectives, even when the lives they save belong to those who tried to kill them. The gesture had been devastating to Vorthak morale. Soldiers who had deployed biological weapons against civilians were then saved by those same civilians when their own weapons turned against them. The contradiction shattered. Understanding of warfare and honor. Sang-wook included a personal message with the medical files, Thexvar continued. He said that healing was always possible, even after the greatest harm. He hoped that humans and Vorthak could someday heal the wounds between their species as well. The biological warfare campaign had been officially terminated 3 days later. Not because of military failure, but because Vorthak commanders could no longer justify using such weapons against an enemy who responded with medical aid. What happened to the survivors on the medical station? Kolthara asked. They continued working, Thexvar replied. Treating wounded from both sides, developing better medical protocols, sharing research that saved lives throughout the war. Zone. The Geneva Medical Complex had become a neutral zone by unspoken agreement. Both sides sent their wounded there for treatment, knowing they would receive the best possible care regardless of species or allegiance. For the 6th session, Thexvar brought nothing to place on the table. Instead, he sat with his hands folded, staring at the empty surface as if seeing something that was not there. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Some memories are too heavy to carry as objects, he said. They live in here instead. He tapped his scaled forehead with one claw. Kolthara had read the preliminary reports about the Busan Military Academy incident. The official files were sparse, containing only basic casualty figures and operational summaries. The details had been classified at the highest levels, deemed too sensitive for general distribution. "Tell me about the children," she said gently. Thexvar was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his words came slowly, as if each one caused physical pain. "We thought it would be easy," he began. "A training facility full of human younglings. No real military value, minimal defenses. We needed a symbolic victory after so many defeats." The Busan Military Academy had housed approximately 800 human children between the ages of 12 and 18. It was a preparatory school where young humans learned basic military concepts, leadership skills, and technical knowledge. In Vorthak society, such institutions were ceremonial at best. "How many troops did you deploy?" Kolthara asked. "2 full battalions," Thexvar replied. 1,600 elite soldiers against 800 children. Command expected total victory within 6 hours. The attack had begun at dawn with orbital bombardment designed to destroy the Academy's communication systems and prevent calls for reinforcement. The human children had been trapped with no hope of rescue and no way to call for help. "What was the first sign that this operation would be different?" Kolthara asked. "They did not surrender," Thexvar said simply. "We transmitted standard surrender demands in perfect human language. The response came from a 16-year-old cadet named Min Ho. Min Ho had been the senior student at the academy, a thin boy with serious eyes who should have been studying mathematics and history instead of commanding a desperate defense. His response to the surrender demand had been broadcast on all frequencies, so every Vorthak soldier could hear it. "He thanked us for the warning," Thexvar continued. "Then he told us that the academy was under the protection of its students, and that we were welcome to try to take it." The politeness had been more unsettling than any threat could have been. The boy had spoken like he was inviting guests to dinner, not facing an army that could kill him in seconds. The first assault. Waves met unexpected resistance, Thexvar explained. These children had turned their school into a fortress. Student leader Yuna, barely 15 years old, had coordinated the defensive preparations with efficiency that impressed even veteran Vorthak officers. She had organized supply lines, established firing positions, and created overlapping fields of fire that made approach nearly impossible. Yuna had been studying logistics theory, Thexvar said. She applied classroom concepts to real combat situations. Her defensive plan was better than most we had seen from professional armies. The human children had used their knowledge of the academy buildings to create advantages that adult defenders might never have considered. They knew every ventilation shaft, every hidden passage, every structural weakness that could be exploited. Technical prodigy Wu Jin was 14 years old, Thexvar continued. He had been taking advanced computer courses. When our forces attacked, he somehow gained access to our communication networks. Wu Jin had not just intercepted Vorthak transmissions. He had actively participated in their tactical communications, inserting false orders that led units into ambushes and coordinated friendly fire incidents. He was giving our soldiers orders in perfect Vorthak military code, Thexvar explained. Officers followed commands from a human child because the orders sounded completely authentic. The boy had studied Vorthak language and military protocols as part of his academy coursework. In combat, this academic knowledge became a weapon more effective than any gun or bomb. "How long did the first assault last?" Kolthara asked. 18 hours, Thexvar replied. 18 hours to advance 300 meters against children who should have broken in minutes. The human children had fought with the same terrifying intensity as adult soldiers. They showed no fear of death, no panic under fire, no tendency to break ranks when faced with overwhelming odds. They moved like trained soldiers, Thexvar said, but they thought like children. Their tactics were creative in ways that confused our responses. Student teams had used playground equipment as weapons platforms. They had turned dormitory furniture into barricades and improvised explosive devices. They had converted sports equipment into tools of war with ingenuity that defied standard tactical analysis. The most disturbing aspect was their coordination, Thexvar continued. They worked together perfectly, without the ego conflicts or hesitation that plague adult units. 15-year-old Yuna had coordinated supply runs through enemy fire, ensuring that defending positions never ran out of ammunition or medical supplies. She had organized these missions using students as young as 12, children who should have been too terrified to move. The supply runners showed no fear, Thexvar said. They treated it like a game, racing through our kill zones while laughing and calling encouragement to each other. The psychological impact on Vorthak forces had been immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had fought in multiple campaigns found themselves unable to maintain aggression against opponents who looked like children but fought like elite warriors. Many of our troops began refusing orders, Thexvar admitted. They could not bring themselves to fire on human younglings, even when those younglings were actively trying to kill them. The situation had deteriorated further when the human children began taking prisoners. Instead of killing captured Vorthak soldiers, they had disarmed them and provided medical treatment for wounds. 12-year-old student Hansol treated my wounded soldiers with the same care she would show injured pets, Thexvar said. She bandaged their wounds, gave them water, and spoke to them gently while they recovered. The kindness had been more devastating than cruelty could have been. Vorthak soldiers found themselves being helped by the same children they had been ordered to kill. The contradiction broke something fundamental in military psychology. On day 3, Minho sent another message, Thexvar continued. He offered to treat our wounded soldiers in the Academy's medical bay. The 16-year-old cadet had proposed a temporary ceasefire to allow medical evacuations. He had explained that the Academy had trained medics who could provide better treatment than field doctors could offer. Several of our officers accepted the offer, Thexvar said. They sent wounded soldiers to be treated by enemy children. The human students had provided excellent medical care without attempting to extract information or gain tactical advantage. They had simply helped injured beings because helping was the right thing to do. Student medic Ji Young was 13 years old, Thexvar said. She performed surgery on a Vorthak officer who had been trying to kill her hours earlier. She saved his life and asked nothing in return. The final assault had been ordered on day 6, when command decided that the Academy had to be taken regardless of cost. Fresh troops with explicit orders to show no mercy had been brought in to end the resistance. What happened when the new troops attacked? Kolthara asked. The children met them at the gates, Thexvar replied, not hiding in their fortress, but standing in formation on the Academy grounds. Minho had led the students in one final defense. They had sung their school anthem while forming defensive lines, their young voices carrying across the battlefield with heartbreaking clarity. They knew they were going to die, Thexvar said, but they faced death with courage that put our veteran soldiers to shame. The battle had lasted 6 hours. The human children had fought with weapons improvised from school supplies, coordinated by hand signals learned in classrooms, sustained by loyalty to each other that transcended rational fear. How many casualties did your forces suffer? Kolthara asked quietly. 437 dead, Thexvar replied. Nearly 600 wounded, against children who should not have been able to fight at all. The final moment of the battle remained burned into Thexvar's memory. Minho had been the last defender standing, wounded and surrounded, but still refusing to surrender. He was holding a textbook, Thexvar said. A mathematics textbook that he had apparently been studying between battles. When we demanded his surrender, he smiled and asked if we could wait 5 minutes while he finished his homework. The boy had died still holding the book, having never stopped being a student even while commanding a military defense that cost hundreds of enemy lives. The academy fell on day 6, Thexvar concluded, but we lost more than soldiers in that battle. We lost the ability to see humans as just another enemy species. The surviving Vorthak troops had needed extensive psychological treatment after the academy operation. Many had requested transfers away from combat zones. Some had refused to participate in further attacks against human populations. What did this engagement teach you? Colthera asked. Thexvar entered the 7th session carrying a simple data pad. Unlike the previous objects he had brought, this one was Vorthak technology. Standard military issue, the kind carried by every officer in the fleet. But the way he held it suggested it contained something precious. Battle recordings, he explained as he set it on the table, from the final engagement at Geneva. The last time Vorthak forces met humans in open battle. Colthara recognized the location from strategic briefings. Geneva had been the site of human diplomatic headquarters, a city with symbolic importance, but limited military value. It should have been an easy target for the final push of the invasion. How many human defenders were stationed there? She asked. 300, Thexvar replied. 300 volunteers led by General Dong-hyun. General Dong-hyun had been 63 years old, a veteran officer who should have been enjoying retirement instead of commanding a desperate last stand. Intelligence files described him as a logistics specialist with limited combat experience. Against how many Vorthak forces? 100,000 soldiers, Thexvar said. The entire 1st Army Group. Command wanted to end the war with a decisive victory that would force human surrender. The battle had been planned as the final demonstration of Vorthak military superiority. Overwhelming force against token resistance broadcast across human space to show the futility of continued resistance. Tell me about the volunteers, Colthera prompted. They came from everywhere, Thexvar said, his voice filled with something between admiration and horror. Soldiers, civilians, children, elderly. Anyone who could hold a weapon and was willing to die for their species. Colonel Soo-jin had been Dong-hyun's second-in-command, a former teacher who had volunteered for military service when the invasion began. She had no formal military training beyond basic courses, but she understood human psychology better than any trained officer. Soo-jin organized the volunteers into combat units based on their willingness to sacrifice rather than their military skills, Thexvar explained. The most determined fighters were given the most dangerous assignments. Among the volunteers had been Ji-hoon, a mechanic who had converted civilian vehicles into armored fighting platforms. Na-rae, a doctor who had insisted on serving in combat, roles despite her medical training. Seung-ho, a teenager who had lied about his age to join the defense force. They were not professional soldiers, Thexvar continued, but they fought with dedication that made our elite troops look weak by comparison. The battle had begun with a massive orbital bombardment designed to break human morale before ground forces even landed. For 6 hours, the sky above Geneva, had burned with weapons fire that should have reduced the city to rubble. What was the effect of the bombardment? Kolthara asked. Minimal, Thexvar replied. The humans had prepared underground positions that survived almost everything we could throw at them. General Dong Hyun had spent months preparing Geneva for siege. Every building had been fortified. Every street had been turned into a kill zone. Every utility tunnel had been converted into a military position. More importantly, Thexvar continued, the volunteers used the bombardment as motivation rather than allowing it to break their spirits. While alien weapons fell around them, the human defenders had sung their national anthem. Their voices had been audible even over the sound of explosions, carrying across the battlefield with defiant clarity. The ground assault began at dawn. On day 2, Thexvar said, we expected to reach the city center within hours. Instead, the Vorthak advance had been stopped at the outskirts of the city by defenders who seemed to treat death as an acceptable cost of delaying the enemy. Every position had to be taken through direct assault, and every assault cost more lives than it should have. Colonel Su Jin led the first counterattack, Thexvar continued. 200 volunteers against our lead elements. The attack had been strategically pointless. 200 humans against 5,000 Vorthak soldiers in open ground should have been a massacre. Instead, it had become a psychological victory that changed the entire course of the battle. They charged directly into our guns, Thexvar said. Not seeking cover, not trying to preserve their lives, just running straight at us while screaming battle cries. The sight had been terrifying in ways that Vorthak soldiers were not prepared. 4. These humans were not trying to win through tactics or superior firepower. They were trying to win through pure courage and willingness to die. How many of the attackers survived? Kolthara asked. 17, Thexvar replied. 17. Humans broke through our lines and reached our command positions. 17 volunteers with improvised weapons scattered an entire battalion of professional soldiers. The survivors had not tried to escape after their suicidal charge. Instead, they had continued fighting until killed, each one taking multiple Vorthak soldiers with them in hand-to-hand combat that violated every principle of modern warfare. The effect on our troops was immediate, Thexvar continued. Units began reporting combat stress, refusal of orders, requests for evacuation. After one engagement, the human volunteers had somehow turned their own deaths into weapons more effective than any technology. Each fallen defender became a psychological burden on Vorthak forces who had to continue fighting while stepping over the bodies of opponents they could not help but respect. Ji-hoon died defending the main intersection, Thexvar said. He had rigged his vehicle with explosives and drove it into our advancing armor column. The mechanic had waited until Vorthak vehicles were clustered together before detonating his improvised bomb. The explosion had destroyed 6 tanks and blocked the main avenue into the city center. But that was not the remarkable part, Thexvar continued. The remarkable part was what he did before the explosion. Security footage had shown Ji-hoon climbing out of his doomed vehicle to help injured Vorthak soldiers reach safety. Even while preparing to kill dozens of enemy troops, he had taken time to save the lives of individuals who happened to be in the wrong place. Nare held the medical station for 3 days, Thexvar said, treating wounded from both sides while fighting off our attempts to take the position. The doctor had established a field hospital in a fortified building near the city center. She had continued performing surgery even while the building was under direct attack, saving lives while bullets shattered windows around her operating table. She could have evacuated, Thexvar continued. We offered safe passage for medical, personnel multiple times. She refused to abandon her patients. When Vorthak forces finally breached the medical station, they had found Narai still working. She had been killed while attempting to shield wounded soldiers from gunfire, dying while trying to protect the lives of her enemies. Seung-ho was the most disturbing, Thexvar said quietly. 17 years old, fighting like he had been a soldier all his life. The teenager had somehow acquired advanced military equipment and learned to use it with deadly efficiency. He had destroyed more Vorthak vehicles than entire professional units, operating alone with weapons he should not have known how to fire. He moved through the battlefield like death itself, Thexvar continued, appearing from nowhere to attack our forces, then vanishing before we could respond. Intelligence teams had never figured out how Seung-ho had learned such advanced combat skills. He fought with techniques that matched elite special forces, despite having no formal training beyond basic civilian defense courses. The final assault came on day 6, Thexvar said. Every available soldier committed to taking the last human positions. By then, the 300 volunteers had been reduced to fewer than 50 survivors. They were out of ammunition, low, on supplies, and completely surrounded. Any rational force would have surrendered hours earlier. General Dong-hyun sent his final message at dawn, Thexvar continued, broadcast on all frequencies so we could not miss it. The general's message had been simple and devastating. He thanked his volunteers for their service, expressed pride in their courage, and asked them to remember that they died not for territory or politics, but for the right of humans to exist as free beings. Then he asked us to treat human prisoners with dignity, Thexvar said. Even knowing he was about to die, he was concerned about the welfare of others. The last battle had been fought in the ruins of Geneva's Central Plaza. 50 human volunteers against thousands of Vorthak soldiers in a final engagement that should have lasted minutes. It took 6 hours, Thexvar said. 6 hours to kill 50 humans who refused to stop fighting. The volunteers had made their final stand around a statue, commemorating human peace negotiations. They had died defending a monument to diplomacy, even while proving that some things were worth fighting for. General Dong-hyun was the last to fall, Thexvar continued. Shot multiple times, still trying to reach our positions with nothing but a combat knife. The general had died within meters of the Vorthak command post, crawling forward despite wounds that should have killed him hours earlier. His final words had been a request for his soldiers to be buried with honor. We won the battle, Thexvar said. Geneva was ours. The human resistance was broken. The war was over. For the final session, Thexvar brought nothing to place on the table. The surface remained empty as he sat across from Kolthera, his 4 arms folded in a gesture that suggested completion rather than nervousness. No object today? Kolthera asked. The most important lessons cannot be held in your hands, Thexvar replied. They live in understanding. 7 sessions of testimony had documented the complete failure of the Vorthak invasion of Earth. Millions of soldiers defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by something far more dangerous, the absolute refusal of humans to accept defeat. What is your final assessment of the human species? Kolthera asked. Thexvar was quiet for a long moment, organizing thoughts that had been building for months. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. We made a fundamental error in our intelligence analysis, he began. We studied human technology, human military capabilities, human population centers, but we never studied what makes humans human. The invasion had been planned like every other Vorthak military operation. Superior force applied systematically until enemy resistance collapsed and surrender became inevitable. It was a strategy that had worked against dozens of species across multiple star systems. Humans operate from different principles, Thexvar continued. They do not fight to preserve their lives. They fight to preserve their right to choose how they live. Every human name he had spoken during the debriefing sessions represented not just an individual, but a glimpse into the collective soul of their species. Daeho, who fought with one arm. Hyun-woo, who turned a city into a fortress. Jae-sung, who made the Arctic itself into a weapon. Each encounter taught us something new about human nature, Thexvar said. But we were too focused on tactical responses to understand the strategic implications. Sora, who performed surgery while under fire. Tae-jin, who built weapons from garbage. Yoonji, who could hit impossible targets in impossible conditions. Every name represented a different aspect of humanity's refusal to be limited by circumstances. They adapt, Thexvar continued. Not just tactically, but fundamentally. When faced with superior force, they do not retreat. They transform themselves into something that can win anyway. Sunho, who turned his dying ship into a weapon. Ye-jin, who flew escape pods like fighters. Ki-woo, who turned music into psychological warfare. Even in defeat, humans found ways to achieve victory through sacrifice that accomplished more than survival ever could. The biological warfare incident taught us that humans will help their enemies even while those enemies are trying to kill them, Thexvar said. Sang-wook saved Vorthak lives after we deployed plague weapons against his people. This contradiction had been impossible for Vorthak strategists to understand. How could the same species be utterly ruthless in combat while simultaneously showing compassion to their attackers? The children at the academy showed us that humanity's warrior spirit is not learned through training, Thexvar continued. It is inherent in their nature from birth to death. Minho, Yuna, Woo-jin, and hundreds of other young humans had fought with the same dedication as veteran soldiers. They had transformed a school into a fortress and themselves into warriors, without losing their essential humanity. And Geneva. Thexvar paused, remembering the final battle. Geneva showed us that humans can choose to die in ways that make their deaths more powerful than any life. Dong-hyun, Soo-jin, Ji-hoon, Naray, Seung-ho, and 300 volunteers had turned certain defeat into psychological victory. They had died so magnificently that their killers could no longer bear to continue killing. What conclusion do you draw from these observations? Kolthara asked. That we encountered something unprecedented in galactic history, Thexvar replied. A species that has weaponized hope itself. Most beings fought for survival, territory, resources, or ideology. Humans fought for something more abstract, but infinitely more powerful. The right to remain human regardless of circumstances. They never stopped believing they could win, Thexvar continued. Even when victory was impossible, even when death was certain, even when logic demanded surrender, they maintained hope and turned that hope into strength. This had been the key factor that Vorthak military analysts had failed to account for. Human morale did not break under pressure. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger with each impossible challenge. Every battle we won cost us more than defeat would have, Thexvar said. Because humans made us pay not just in soldiers and equipment, but in the certainty that we were fighting for the right cause. The invasion had been justified as bringing order to a chaotic species, offering the benefits of Vorthak civilization to primitive humans. But after months of combat, it had become clear that humans possessed something that Vorthak society had lost. "They have unity without conformity," Thexvar explained. "Every human we encountered was completely individual, yet they worked together with perfect coordination when threatened. Daeho's individual courage, Yunwoo's tactical genius, Sang-wook's medical dedication, Minho's young leadership, Dong-hyun's final sacrifice. Each had been unique, but all had served the same cause without coordination or central planning. We realized that we were not fighting an army," Thexvar continued. "We were fighting an entire species that had chosen to become an army. The distinction was crucial. Military forces could be defeated through superior strategy and overwhelming force. But how could any strategy defeat an entire species that refused to be conquered? The humans taught us something about the nature of sapient life," Thexvar said. "We had forgotten what it means to fight for principles rather than interests. Vorthak society had become comfortable, efficient, and peaceful. Military service was a profession like any other. Wars were fought for logical objectives, and defeat was accepted when costs exceeded benefits. Humans reminded us that some things are worth any sacrifice," Thexvar continued. "Freedom, dignity, the right to exist as they choose to exist. They will die for these concepts, and in dying for them, they make them real." This was the lesson that Command had refused to acknowledge in official reports. The invasion had failed, not because of tactical errors or insufficient resources, but because they had attacked something that could not be conquered by force. "What is your recommendation regarding future human contact?" Kolthara asked. "Never again," Thexvar replied without hesitation. "Never again should any species make war upon humanity." The words carried the weight of absolute conviction. Thexvar had seen what humans were capable of when threatened, and he knew that no military force in the galaxy was prepared to face that level of dedication. "They are apex predators," he continued, "but not in the way we understand predation. They do not hunt for territory or resources. They hunt for the right to remain free. This made them more dangerous than any conventional military force. Armies could be defeated, governments could be toppled, planets could be conquered. But how? Could anyone defeat the idea of freedom itself? "The humans will spread across the galaxy," Thexvar predicted. "Not as conquerors, but as examples. Other species will see what they accomplished and remember what they themselves had forgotten." The Vorthak invasion had been intended to demonstrate superior military power. Instead, it had advertised human capabilities to every species in the galaxy. The recordings of human courage would spread far beyond official military channels. "We gave them the greatest gift possible," Thexvar realized. "We showed them exactly how strong they are. Before the invasion, humans had been an isolated species with limited interstellar contact. After the invasion, they would know that they could face any threat and emerge victorious through sheer determination. Our defeat was complete," Thexvar concluded. "Not just military defeat, but moral defeat. We lost the right to call ourselves the superior species." The recording device continued humming between them, capturing the final testimony in a series that would reshape Vorthak understanding of warfare, courage, and the nature of sapient life itself. "Will these debriefings be made public?" Thexvar asked. "That depends on Command," Kolthara replied. "The implications are significant." "The implications are simple," Thexvar corrected. "We learned that there are beings in this galaxy who are better than us. Not stronger, Not more advanced, but better. And we learned it by trying to destroy them. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Every name I spoke in these sessions represents a human who died fighting us, he said. But their deaths accomplished something greater than their lives could have. They taught an entire galaxy what courage looks like. The door closed behind him, leaving Kolthara alone with 8 sessions of testimony that would change everything. The human war was over, but the human lesson would continue forever. Some species, she realized, were meant to be teachers rather than students. And humanity had just given the galaxy the most important lesson it had ever received: that freedom is worth any price, and beings who truly believe that cannot be conquered by any force in the universe. The empty table reflected the overhead, lights holding nothing but the weight of understanding. The most powerful truths, as Thexvar had said, could not be held in hands. They lived in the space between memory and hope, where courage transformed ordinary beings into something eternal.